So a couple of thoughts here that I want to share based on what I've seen so far today, and I want to kick it off by saying a special thank you to Gary Tintereau, who's the head of the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, where we all are. And I'm not sure if Gary is here or if he's attended, but I hope he's gotten a glimpse of the magnificent program that's being put on today, and an extra special thank you to Charles Birnbaum and the Cultural Landscape Foundation. But Gary, from the very beginning, many of you probably know Gary, he actually grew up in Houston. And unlike some folks of his and my generation, he actually came back. There was a sort of a dearth of, there was kind of a brain drain for a while. And Gary went off and was at the Metropolitan Museum, as many of you know, and he came back to run the MFA. But one of the first public communications from him really struck a chord with me. He was interviewed by the Chronicle, and he spoke about the importance of the connection between the museum, in that particular instance, Herman Park. And when I had the honor of leading the committee to select the design team for Memorial Park, the first call I made was to Gary to ask him if I could use his conference room to host the interviews, because one of the many, perhaps, crazy missions I'm on is this idea of this thinking about all of our assets. And my life is in the investment business, so financial security is certainly paramount. But thinking about cultural assets, art, culture, landscape, health and wellness is really one seamless expression of prosperity. It seems to me, I believe that we live in the greatest country in the world, and it seems to me that that should be an evolved idea that most of us should accept. And Gary, being Gary, immediately said, absolutely, you can use a conference room at the museum. I thought it was a conference room in the museum, but he gave us his personal conference room to host those interviews. And I wanted people who were part of the process to start associating what I think is an integral connection between art and culture as an expression of vitality in an urban city in the 21st century. So with regard to the Cultural Landscape Foundation and Charles Birnbaum, I was lucky enough to read an article about him in Garden Design, I think it was some years ago. I was almost run over in a parking lot at the Randalls at the corner of Westheimer and Shepherd some years ago, and it turned out to be a happy event because I wasn't injured. But the person who was driving turned out to be a neighbor and became a dear friend, and it was Susan Keaton and her neighbor and friend Marley Law, who changed my life, because I had moved back after being away for 15 years and was struggling quite a bit because Houston in the early 1990s was a very different city from the city we live in today. And Susan looked at me and she said, you don't know who I am, but I know who you are, and you're coming to my house tomorrow night. And I followed instructions, which is sometimes hard for me to do, and I ended up in her living room with, of all people, Laurie Olin, who was speaking at that time about an idea that most people in Houston, other than the early founders of what's now the Herman Park Conservancy, Susan and Marley among them, Bill Coates, Jay Baker, Lewis Sklar, many, many amazing people. Jane Curtis came to Houston because of Laurie Olin's work there. Believed in this idea that folks at the time just couldn't really get their head around that this park, which was not quite 100 years old, in those days it was more like 80 years old, that had been gifted by the city, importantly to me, by a businessman who believed in the economic vitality of the city, but also believed that the citizens of Houston deserved a magnificent public space. And that park, we heard earlier today very eloquently from others, so I won't get into it, that had been frayed beyond description, and we were all on a mission to try to change that, and of course the rest is history. I have this slide here on the board because I think it's interesting that so often, and I'm a huge advocate and fan of the incredible work that's been done along Buffalo Bayou on the west side of downtown, but I think it's interesting that we look at the city of Houston so infrequently from this perspective. I found a friend who does woodblock prints to take a photograph that I found of, this of course is the Port of Houston with downtown Houston in the background. And I think it's really important when we have these discussions about landscape and place, which has been described far better than I can do by many of the people here today, that we somehow forget why most of us are here, or at least many of us came in the first place. And so showing the city, I think this is an image that I would challenge us to use more frequently as we think about how the city evolves in terms of its development of parks and infrastructure. Because so many of the spaces we've talked about today are, I think, the templates which we can replicate across the city, but many of the ones we've talked about so far fall in a fairly specific geographic region of the city rather than on the east side. Now, bio-greenways, which of course has been talked about today, is really something that has the opportunity in the most incredible of ways to knit it all together. And of course, so much of that touches the east side. So taking a page from Thomas Waltz's Introductions. Wendell Berry quote that he's often used when he makes introductions is, and I think I've got this right because I looked it up, it says, if you don't know where you're from, you'll have a hard time saying where you're going. So I like starting with this slide in the terms of this idea of context. And if you go back to the history of the city of Houston, the ship channel is actually about 100 years old. I think it celebrated its 100th birthday last year. I think I'm correct on this, but if I'm not, I'm pretty close. I believe it was the first truly public-private partnership in the United States of any scale and size. So much of course, what we're talking about in these landscape projects, whether they're in Houston or elsewhere, are based on this public-private partnership model. But I think it's really interesting and perhaps surprising to some that this notion of a very creative structure actually originated in a place like Houston. I also think that looking at this image speaks to, we like to talk about ourselves, and I'm approaching so much of this conversation from a business person's perspective, which I think is very important. We're a business city. We're a money talks kind of town, for better or worse, and in the past we've often been lambasted for that. I think we're now being celebrated because I think we're finding what I would call the higher resonance of how we apply that to a much bigger problem. But looking at an image like this speaks to the global aspirations of the city from the very beginning, to the creativity, to the innovation, to the notion of this place as a center of global trade. And I think it's fascinating to think when you look at economic history of this region, oil and natural gas and lots of other things related to minerals have been sources of fabulous wealth creation, of which we're all arguably amazing beneficiaries. But I would say that it's important to remember that the early commerce, including the fortunes of people like Mr. Rice and George Herman and a number of others, actually came from other industries, timbers often, cotton, and the shipping business. So that's just an interesting note. I also want to raise this issue of using the ship channel because the ship channel is really the extension of our biosystem. We've talked a lot about connectivity today. I'd like to sort of challenge us to replace that word or maybe complement that word with the notion of connection. It feels to me like across the country, we have this frayed and fraying social fabric. And one of the reasons that I got so interested in public park work in Houston was it was one of the last places I could find in a place like Texas, which is my home, where everybody mixed. And it was an intensely democratic, no politics here, intensely democratic space. And Jane eloquently quoted from the master plan from Herman Park about the idea of a civic and urban park as a refuge for everybody. So that notion of using our creativity, our imagination, our landscape to do the best we can to stitch back a frayed social fabric. I think landscape and beauty and what I call something bigger than ourselves has a real opportunity to do that. And it's especially gratifying to me that we're doing so much of this pioneering work in Houston. This is another thought that's been touched on already, but I just want to hone in and try to underline it a few more times, is the notion of the economics we're talking about here. I know many of you are well versed on this, so forgive me if I'm saying what you already know, but it's astounding to me that generational shifts in terms of attitudes and concepts around living in urban cities and why people make the choices that they do. I am proud of Houston as a global city, and we love to talk about it that way, and certainly in many aspects we are. But I would say that if we expect to be the dynamic, vibrant, one of the best cities in the world, globally dominant, in the 21st century, we're well on our way in some of these projects here to knitting together the pieces that I think are required to make this place a magnet for intellectual capital. What's so startling to me is when you read the statistics, and I'm so lucky that on my panel I have an amazing group of panelists, but folks that are not only involved in city leadership, but also at the Kinder Institute. So the hard data is right in front of us. So this whole next generation is actually deciding where they want to live first, and then they go look for a job. And I didn't really believe that. I'm around a lot of often very linear thinkers in my business profession, and I tossed it out one day and everybody thought it was absurd and ridiculous. Many of you may know the work of Jeff Speck, who's written a number of books, but the one I know is called Walkable Cities. But not only are people choosing the city they want to live in first and then looking for a job, a lot of them aren't getting their driver's licenses. Now in Texas, we've often thought of public transportation as some sort of a socialist plot, but I think it's really interesting to think that Houston actually had one of the most advanced urban transportation systems for a city of its size until all of the tracks got ripped up. And we talked about the Gulf Freeway. earlier today. I think in the day of the electric railroad from downtown Houston to downtown Galveston, you could make it much faster than you can today on the Gulf Freeway. So I think it makes me think a little bit more about how we process progress. So my point here is that this is an economic issue as much as it is a landscape issue. And I think that one of the most incredible moments for me, having come back now more than 25 years ago and worked in the early days of the Herman Park restoration, is that there's a recognition across the city and perhaps across the country that that's a reality. And I'm particularly thankful to, and I know she's been brought up a few times today, but the Nancy Kinder and Rich Kinder and the Kinder Foundation, because it was the first moment that I could see where we were seeing this amazing and necessary intersection between commerce and landscape and vibrant public spaces. So with all of that, I'm going to slip here to a slide or image that was a profound influence on me in my childhood. This is an image many of you probably know. It's called the Blue Marble. It was the first high-resolution color image of Earth from space. I grew up here, and I'm obsessed about many things, but one of them was the space program. And to me, this speaks of, much as the port image did a moment ago, of the notion of possibility, of infinite possibility. We're going to put a man on the moon in 10 years. And it feels to me like we're at a moment in time where we need to put another man on the moon in 10 years, not literally, but figuratively. The problems that we're dealing with are so intense and so profound. I believe we have the imagination, the creativity to do so. And I also believe that the natural systems and the natural landscape has huge potential to be able to do that. This is a less inspired image. This is thankfully this isn't Houston, but many of you may know this. This is the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, 1969, catching on fire. And if the previous image was what I call the higher resonance of globalization, I think that first image was actually the first sort of idea that people were thinking about the planet as interconnected. This is what I would call the lower resonance of human technology. And the reason I put this image up here is that not too many years ago, the San Jacinto River east of here actually did catch on fire. And I think that, again, to maybe in speaking with Thomas and his colleagues at NBW, they're doing some really interesting work on the Gowanus Canal in New York. And a lot of my background is in working around innovations like the sequencing of the human genome and the plant genome. And I would argue that chemistry and natural systems actually hold the solution to many of the problems that we're trying to resolve now. And want to just keep that thought out there as we talk today. In 2002, as I wrap this up, The Economist published an article that horrified many. It was called The Future is Texas. It's December of 2002. Interestingly to me, it was just after 9/11. And it makes many points in the article. You don't need to read it, but I want to hold this up here as we have our panel questions, because there are some, the demographic shift, particularly in Texas, and the economic reality here. The writer here makes a compelling case of why the future is in fact Texas. And at the time when people read this, nobody could believe it. It was very early in so much of the work we're doing in terms of making cities like Houston what I call magnets for intellectual capital. But if you reread it now, it's really interesting to see what has come together in the most inspired of ways to be able to create a world that, as I say, I would like to live in. So in closing, before I turn it over to the panelists, the last paragraph in this particular article has always been a source of inspiration for me. It says, the real test for Texas will not be whether it can play a leading role in shaping America and so the world. That much is already encoded in demographic and economic trends. It will be whether Texans and Texas can become a better place in the process. So I proudly accept that challenge, and I welcome any and all of you to join me in doing the same. So thank you.